She arrived with one trunk, a sewing kit, and a letter she hadn't finished reading. And before the dust from the stagecoach even settled, she was already on her knees in the dirt, tearing apart everything the man had built. Gideon Mercer had sent for a wife who would keep his house clean and his meals on time. What showed up instead was a woman who looked at his land and saw something he had been too broken to notice. This is the story of what happens when a man thinks he's buying peace and gets a revolution instead. If this story finds you somewhere far from home, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this travels. The stagecoach from Abilene arrived 40 minutes late, which was early by Kansas standards. Gideon Mercer stood at the edge of the road with his hat in his hands and sweat drying on the back of his neck, watching the horses slow to a stop in front of his gate. He'd been standing there since noon. It was nearly 1:30. He hadn't moved because he wasn't sure what to do with himself while he waited. And he wasn't sure what to do with himself when she got here either, so standing still seemed like the least dangerous option. He had written the letter in February. A plain, honest letter. He wasn't a man who dressed things up, stating that he was 34 years old, owned 160 acres outside a town called Harlan Creek, had a working well, a sound roof, and no children from his first marriage. He said his wife Clara had passed 3 years prior from fever. He said he was looking for a woman with a steady disposition who didn't mind hard country. He sent it to the placement agency in St. Louis and paid the fee and tried not to think too much about what he was doing. Miriam Ashcroft had written back in March. Her letter was 2 pages. It covered her age, 25, her upbringing in Western Ohio, her experience keeping house for a farming family after her own father died, and one sentence near the end that he'd read 4 times without quite understanding. I am not a woman who does well with idleness, so you should know that going in. He hadn't known what to make of it. But her handwriting was clean, and she didn't make spelling errors, and she didn't ask him anything about his finances, which he took as a decent sign. They'd exchanged 3 more letters. He'd asked if she could cook. She said well enough. She'd asked if there was a garden. He said there used to be. She wrote back a single line. I suppose we'll see about that. Now the coach door swung open, and Gideon watched a woman climb down without waiting for the driver's hand. She was shorter than he'd imagined. He hadn't imagined much. With dark hair pinned up under a practical gray hat and a canvas traveling bag slung over one shoulder. She had a trunk, which the driver hefted off the back and set in the dust with a thud. She looked at it, looked at Gideon, and walked toward him across the uneven road. Mr. Mercer, she said. Not a question. Miss Ashcroft. He put his hat back on because he didn't know where else to put it. Good trip? Long, she said. She looked past him at the ranch. He watched her eyes move across it, the fence, the house, the yard, the barn further back. The same way a person reads a letter, taking it in piece by piece. Her expression didn't tell him much. This is your place. It is. She nodded once, like she was settling something with herself, and picked up one handle of the trunk. Other side, she said. He grabbed the other handle and they carried it up the path together without speaking. Bop. The front yard was what it had always been, a spread of pale gravel that Gideon's father had hauled in by the cartload back in the early days, decorative in the way that men sometimes did things to make a frontier homestead look less like a frontier homestead. It covered the ground from the gate to the porch steps in a rough oval, gray and chalky in the afternoon sun. Miriam stopped walking when they were halfway across it. Gideon stopped too because the trunk went with her. Something wrong? She was looking down at the ground. Not at her feet. At the ground. In the focused way you look at something you're trying to understand. She crouched, still holding her side of the trunk, which made the whole thing tilt sideways. Gideon held on. Could you hold this a second? She said. It wasn't quite a question. She set her corner down and he caught the weight awkwardly, nearly dropping it. She brushed the gravel aside with her palm, digging her fingers into the edge of the layer. The gravel shifted and she pulled some away, and what was underneath was dark, almost black, the kind of soil that took years of composted leaves and rainfall to build up into something. Miriam sat back on her heels. How deep does this go? She asked. The gravel? Gideon set the trunk down properly. I don't know. My father put it down. How far back? 20, 25 years maybe. She dug her fingers in again, working a small section clear, and came up with a handful of the soil and squeezed it. It held its shape. She opened her hand and looked at it, and then looked at him. "Do you know what this is?" "It's dirt," he said. "It's the best topsoil I've seen in 4 years." She stood up and brushed her hand on her skirt. "You've got it buried under decorative rock." Gideon looked at the gravel. He'd never really thought about it. It was just the yard. His father had always kept it that way. "My father liked the look of it." "I'm sure he did," Miriam said. She picked up her corner of the trunk again. "We can talk about it later." He carried the trunk the rest of the way to the porch without saying anything. She didn't eat much at supper. He'd made the same thing he always made, Chet. Beans from a pot he kept on the back of the stove, and cornbread from a batch he'd mixed that morning. It wasn't impressive, but it was food, and he'd laid the table properly with the dishes Claire used to use, which felt like either the right thing to do or the wrong thing. He couldn't tell. Miriam ate about half of what was on her plate and asked him 3 questions. How many acres were currently being worked, what he'd planted last season, and whether the well had ever run dry in summer. 40 of the 160, he said. Corn mostly, a little winter wheat. The well's been reliable. What happened to the other 120? Some's pasture, some's just land. He paused. My wife, Clara, she used to keep a kitchen garden on the east side of the house. After she passed, I didn't keep up with it. How long ago did it go fallow? 3 years? She nodded and looked at her plate. And the front yard. Your father, was he the kind of man who'd be bothered if someone changed something he built? Gideon thought about his father for a moment. Thomas Mercer had been a stubborn, weathered man who'd broken this land himself and believed in doing things a certain way because that was the way they were done. He'd been dead for 7 years. He's gone, Gideon said. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. She was watching him with a directness that was a little uncomfortable, not hostile, just precise, like she was trying to figure out the exact dimensions of something. He'd have had opinions about it, Gideon said finally, but you wouldn't. It wasn't quite a question. He thought about it honestly. Not especially, he said. It's just a yard. She nodded again, satisfied with that, and went back to her beans. He woke up the next morning to the sound of something he couldn't immediately identify. It was early. The light was still low and thin, barely past 5, and the sound was rhythmic, scraping. He lay still for a moment, thinking it was an animal at the fence, then sat up and looked out the window. Miriam was in the front yard. She'd been up before he had, apparently by some margin, because she'd already cleared a substantial section of the gravel, maybe a quarter of the oval, and piled it in an uneven heap near the gate. She was on her knees with what looked like a flat-bladed spade, working the edge of the cleared area and scooping gravel into a wooden bucket he recognized from the barn. Her dress was pushed up to her knees. Her hat was on the gatepost. Gideon put on his boots and went outside. What are you doing? He said. It came out flat, not angry exactly, but something in the neighborhood of stunned. She sat back and looked up at him. What does it look like? You're tearing up my yard. I'm removing rocks from good soil. She turned back and kept working. Hand me that other bucket? He didn't move. He stood at the edge of the porch looking at the damage, or what he kept calling damage in his head even though he couldn't articulate why, and tried to figure out how he was supposed to respond to this. She'd been here less than 18 hours. She hadn't asked. She hadn't mentioned it again after supper. She'd apparently just gotten up at some hour before the sun and started. Miriam. He tried to keep his voice level. You could have... This is something we should have discussed. She stopped working and looked at him again. I told you last night I wanted to talk about it. And He stopped. She had said that. He'd said later, and then they'd finished supper and she'd gone to bed, and he'd assumed the conversation had been postponed indefinitely, the way most conversations got postponed indefinitely out here. I didn't think you meant today. When else? She set the spade down across her knees. Mr. Mercer, I understand this is your property, and you're the one who decides what happens to it. I'm not trying to... She paused, choosing the word. I'm not trying to run over you, but that soil is going to waste, and the season's already started, and every week that goes by is a week we can't get back. She looked at him steadily. If you want me to stop, say so. The silence between them lasted about 5 seconds. The bucket's by the barn, he said. She turned back to the gravel. He went to get the second bucket. They worked until 8:30. By then the morning was warm and Gideon's back was aching in the particular way that came from bending over at the wrong angle for 2 hours. He straightened up and looked at what they'd done. 3/4 of the gravel moved now, piled along the fence in an ugly practical heap, and felt something that was hard to name. Not pride, not yet. Something more like the uneasiness that comes right before a thing becomes real. His neighbor, Delbert Foss, appeared at the fence around 9. Delbert was 60-something, wide in the chest, with a face that looked like it had had opinions pressed into it over many decades. He and Gideon had been neighbors since Gideon was a boy. He leaned on the fence post and looked at the dismantled yard, and then at Miriam, who was raking the cleared soil into rows, and then at Gideon. "This the wife?" Delbert said. "This is Miss Ashcroft," Gideon said. It's a trial arrangement." He hadn't figured out quite what to call it. The ceremony was scheduled for 2 weeks out after a suitable settling-in period. That had been the agency's recommendation. Delbert watched Miriam work for a moment. "What's she doing to your father's yard?" "Improving it," Miriam said without looking up. Delbert's eyebrows went up. He glanced at Gideon. "She thinks there's good soil under there," Gideon said. "There's good soil under there," Miriam said. "What I found this morning could run 4 or 5 vegetable beds easy, maybe more. Squash, beans, root vegetables, greens." She paused to move a clod of gravel with her boot. "You're losing maybe 2 or 3 months of growing season every year just leaving this covered." Delbert stared at her for a moment. Then he looked at Gideon. "Where'd you find this one?" "St. Louis agency," Gideon said. Delbert watched her a little longer. His expression was something between skepticism and reluctant curiosity. "Doesn't waste time, does she?" "Apparently not," Gideon said. Miriam didn't respond to either of them. She kept raking. The town of Harlan Creek had a post office, a dry goods store, a small church at the edge of the road, and enough people with not enough to do that news traveled faster than horses. By the following Thursday, 5 days after Miriam's arrival, there were already 2 distinct versions of events circulating. The first version, favored mostly by women who'd heard it from other women, was relatively neutral. The Mercer man had gotten his mail-order bride and she'd immediately started tearing up the yard, which was either practical or disrespectful depending on who you asked. The second version, which had been shaped and sharpened in the back corner of the dry goods store by a man named Harv Pickett, who'd heard something third-hand and improved upon it considerably, was that the woman had arrived and taken over the whole property, and that Gideon Mercer was already being managed by his own wife before the marriage was even legal. Gideon heard this version from Delbert, who reported it without any apparent concern for how Gideon might feel about it. "Harv says you look like a man who's lost his boots and can't find the floor," Delbert said. They were at the fence again, Delbert's favorite position for conversation, apparently. Miriam was in the cleared yard, which was now fully exposed. The soil raked clean and divided into 8 long beds with twine and small stakes she'd asked Gideon to cut. "Harv Pickett's never had an original idea in his life," Gideon said. "He's got plenty of ideas, most of them are wrong, but they're there." Delbert tilted his head toward Miriam. "She bothering you?" Gideon thought about that honestly. She'd rearranged his kitchen to her own logic, which had annoyed him until he realized he could find things faster. She'd asked about the East Garden plot, and he'd shown her, and she'd spent half a day with a hoe clearing it. She made strong coffee and didn't apologize for it. She asked questions at supper. Real questions, not small talk, about the land, the market prices in town, how far it was to the rail station. She hadn't bothered him. She'd disrupted him, which was a different thing. "No," he said. Delbert nodded slowly. "She's got ideas about the railroad workers," he said. "Mentioned it to my wife when she came by." "I know. Rail crew comes through twice a week, big group. I know. That's a lot of hungry men." "Delbert," Gideon looked at him. "I know." She brought it up properly over supper that same night, because that was when they talked. She'd established it without formally establishing it, conversation at supper, the rest of the day each of them moving in their own directions and somehow getting things done. "The railroad crew," she said. "I figured that was coming," he said. She laid her fork down. "They stopped just east of your fence line to water the horses. I've seen them twice now. They're out there for 45 minutes, and there's nowhere to buy food between here and town. That's always been the case. That's not an argument for leaving it that way. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket and smoothed it on the table between them. She'd written something out, not elaborate, just a column of vegetables and estimated yields and rough prices. Her handwriting was that same clean, purposeful script from her letters. If the front beds go in by end of this month, we could have green beans and early squash ready by early summer. Eggs we've got now? You've got 12 hens. He looked at the paper. The stand. A simple table by the gate would be enough to start. We're not talking about a store. She tapped the paper. A man who's been working rail since before sunrise will spend money on a piece of bread and a bag of carrots. Every time. Gideon looked at the numbers she'd written. They were careful, conservative numbers. She hadn't overestimated anything. He appreciated that. He'd known people who put dream numbers on paper and called it planning. It'd take some building, he said. A proper stand. I can build a table, she said. I didn't say you couldn't. He looked up at her. I'm saying I'll do it, if we're doing this. She watched him for a moment. Are we doing this? He looked at the paper again, at the cleared front yard visible through the window, the raked beds, the soil that had been sitting under rock for 25 years, waiting for someone to decide it mattered. Yeah, he said. I think we are. Miriam picked up her fork and went back to eating like he'd confirmed something she'd already known. Maybe she had. Outside, the last light was going off the fields in long orange strips, and the road that ran past the gate was empty and quiet in the way that it would not always be. Soon it would carry men on their way from work, hungry and dusty, with money in their pockets and nothing to spend it on. Soon there would be a table at the gate, and food on the table, and two people who had arrived at this place sideways, by accident, by paperwork and postage and necessity, discovering that they were building something together. But that night it was just supper going cold on the table, and Gideon Mercer sitting across from a woman he didn't yet know, looking at a piece of paper covered in her careful handwriting, thinking, not for the last time, that whatever he had sent for, it wasn't this, and that maybe, just maybe, this was better. The table Gideon built was not beautiful. He'd used pine boards left over from a fence repair 2 winters ago, dried and a little warped, and he'd put it together on a Saturday morning while Miriam was in the east garden and didn't ask for his opinion. The legs were uneven by about half an inch on one side, which he fixed by nailing a shim under the short foot, and the whole thing wobbled slightly if you pressed down on the left corner. He'd meant to fix that too, but hadn't gotten around to it. He set it up by the gate on a Monday and felt faintly ridiculous doing it. There was nothing on it yet. The garden beds were still 3 weeks from producing anything. But Miriam had sent him into town for a crate of eggs the previous Friday, arguing that they had more than they were eating and the hens weren't slowing down. She'd hard-boiled 2 dozen and wrapped them in a cloth and set them in a shallow wooden bowl on the table with a small handwritten sign. Eggs. 3 cents each, 2 for 5. That was it. That was the whole operation. He went about his morning, patching a section of the north fence where a post had rotted through at the base, and tried not to look at the table too often. It sat out there in the sun, looking like exactly what it was. A warped pine board on wobbly legs with a bowl of hard-boiled eggs on it and a sign his not-yet-wife had written with a carpenter's pencil. The rail crew came through around 10:30, like they did on Mondays. There were 14 of them that day, Gideon counted, moving down the road in that loose, bone-tired way of men who'd been working since before the sun came up. They were headed toward the water stop a quarter-mile east, same as always, except one of them stopped. He was a young man, maybe 19, with a sun-darkened neck and a hat that had seen better years. He stopped at the gate and looked at the table, and then looked toward the house, like he was checking whether he was allowed. He picked up one of the eggs and turned it over in his hand. Gideon was watching from the fence line, trying to look like he wasn't. The young man set the egg down and kept walking. Gideon went back to the fence post. About 2 minutes later, 3 of the crew came back. Bashin. By noon that first Monday, they'd sold 11 eggs and a small jar of cucumber pickles that Miriam had pulled from the cellar, left over from the previous fall, she said, and they needed to be used before summer anyway. Total earnings, 41 cents. Miriam held the coins in her palm and looked at them. That's a start, she said. It's 41 cents, Gideon said. It's 41 cents we didn't have this morning. She put the coins in the jar she had designated for the stand money and set it on the kitchen shelf. And they'll be back Wednesday. They were. And there were more of them on Wednesday. Word had apparently traveled in the way that word travels among men who eat the same bad food every day. Someone wanted to know if there was bread. Miriam had baked 2 loaves that morning, cut them into thick slices, and wrapped the slices in pairs in cloth. She'd also boiled another 3 dozen eggs and added a small crock of butter to the table. She'd written new prices on a fresh piece of paper in her careful hand. By Wednesday evening, the jar had $2.18 in it. Gideon sat at the kitchen table that night looking at the jar and not saying anything for a while. "The flour situation is going to matter," Miriam said. She was standing at the stove with her back to him, washing the bread pans. "If we're baking regularly, we need a reliable supply at a decent price." "Caldwell's Mill," Gideon said. Magnus Caldwell ran the grain operation in Harlan Creek. He was the main supplier for most of the county and had been for as long as Gideon could remember. "He sells flour. Most everyone buys from him." "I know." She paused, setting a pan in the drying rack. "What's his price?" Gideon told her. She turned around and looked at him with an expression that was not quite displeasure, more like someone doing arithmetic in their head and not liking the result. "That's high," she said. "He knows everyone needs it." "That's not a reason to accept it." She turned back to the pans. "I want to know if there are other options." He didn't tell her there weren't. He wasn't sure there were exactly, but he'd learned in the past 2 weeks that Miriam asking a question and being told no and actually accepting no were 3 separate and not necessarily connected events. The garden beds started coming in during the 3rd week of May. It happened the way those things happen, slowly, then suddenly. One morning, the squash plants were knee-high and climbing the stakes Miriam had set, and the bean rows were thick with growth, and there were small, hard tomatoes forming where there'd been nothing 2 weeks before. The lettuce had been ready for a week already. Miriam had planted it at the edges of the beds in a dense band, and they'd been cutting leaves from the outside so the centers kept growing, and it stayed fresh longer that way. She knew things like that. Small, practical things that added up. The table at the gate changed shape over those weeks. Gideon added a second board across the top when the produce started needing space, and Miriam covered it with an old piece of canvas to keep the sun off the eggs and the greens. She made a small shelf underneath for bread, which kept it off the hot surface. The sign grew to include prices for beans by the pound, squash, lettuce bundles, early cucumbers, and eggs by the half dozen. The rail crew was now stopping reliably twice a week, and sometimes sent someone ahead to put in a request. 2 loaves of bread, 4 dozen eggs, and Miriam would have them ready, wrapped and waiting. But it wasn't just the rail crew anymore. A woman named Cecilia Drummond stopped by one Tuesday morning. She and her husband ran a small farm 3 miles south, and she was driving her cart back from town when she saw the produce table and pulled over. She was in her 40s, heavy-set, with a forthright manner and a tendency to say exactly what she thought, which Gideon had always respected about her even when what she thought was inconvenient. She looked at the table for a long moment, then looked at Miriam, who was bringing out a flat of eggs from the house. "You the Mercer woman?" Cecilia asked. "Close enough," Miriam said. "Miriam Ashcroft." They hadn't gotten to the ceremony yet. It kept getting pushed by other things. "Cecilia Drummond." She looked at the produce. "You grew all this?" "In the front yard," Miriam said. Cecilia turned and looked at the beds, visible through the open gate. She was quiet for a moment. "My husband's been saying for 2 years that the soil around here's too worked over to run a kitchen garden. Says it's not worth the effort." "He may be right about his soil," Miriam said. "This yard had a lot of rock on it for a long time. Kept the moisture in underneath." Cecilia looked at her. "Where'd you learn that?" "My father farmed, and I read." Miriam set the flat of eggs on the table. "You need something today?" Cecilia bought lettuce and 2 dozen eggs. But she stood at the gate for another 15 minutes asking questions about the bed layout, the watering schedule, the spacing between plants. She wasn't just making conversation. She was learning something. She came back the following Tuesday with her neighbor, a younger woman named Dot Hensley, whose husband worked the railroad and who had 3 children, and as she put it directly, too much month left at the end of the money. "I heard you might know something about kitchen gardens," Dot said to Miriam. I know some things, Miriam said. What's your situation? How much ground do you have? They talked for 40 minutes. Gideon, passing by on his way to the barn, caught fragments of it. Soil preparation, companion planting, what to do when the bean beetles got bad. Miriam was leaning against the fence with her arms crossed and her hat pushed back on her head, not performing expertise, just talking like someone who knew what she was talking about and was willing to share it. He kept walking to the barn, but he stopped for a moment in the doorway and listened to her voice carrying across the yard, even and certain, and felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't have named precisely. The ceremony happened on a Tuesday. It was small. Gideon, Miriam, a justice of the peace named Harold Fitch, who drove out from town and charged $3 for the service, and Delbert Foss as witness because he was the nearest neighbor and had shown up anyway to return a borrowed plow blade. Fitch was efficient. The whole thing took less than 10 minutes. Delbert shook Gideon's hand afterward and nodded at Miriam with something that had evolved over the past several weeks from skepticism into something resembling respect. "Squash is looking good," he told her. "Give it another week," she said. Fitch drove back toward town. Delbert went home. Miriam went to check on the bread she had rising inside. Gideon stood in the yard for a moment alone, looking at the garden beds and the table at the gate and the house that his father had built, and tried to decide how he felt. It wasn't like he'd imagined, but then he'd stopped imagining things a few weeks into Miriam's arrival because reality kept being stranger and more specific than anything he came up with. He felt married the same way he felt like things were growing, not all at once, but steadily, in a direction that seemed to make sense. He went inside and had lunch. It was Cecilia who first said the word cooperative out loud. She'd become a regular presence by then, and she'd brought Dot Hensley often enough that Dot had started coming on her own. There was also a woman named Ruth Blanchard, whose husband had died the previous winter and who was managing a small property alone, and a girl named Alma, maybe 18, who was staying with her aunt in town and who showed up one morning asking if there was work to be done and was willing to do it for produce instead of pay. Miriam had said yes to Alma without much deliberation. She'd set her to weeding the bean rows and then watched her work for 20 minutes and moved her to the tomatoes, where she seemed more careful with her hands. "You've got people coming," Gideon said one evening. He didn't make it sound like a complaint, but it was an observation that had some weight to it. "I've got people helping," Miriam said. "There's a difference." "Is there an arrangement for what they get out of it?" "There's an understanding." She looked at him across the table. "Cecilia and Dot put in time twice a week. They take produce home proportional to what they bring in. Ruth's got a root cellar that's better than ours, so she's storing overflow. Alma gets paid in kind until we're doing enough volume to pay cash." He stared at her. "You've got a whole system." "Not yet," she said. "It's the start of a system." When did all of this get decided?" "Over the past couple weeks." She seemed genuinely a little puzzled by his surprise. "We talked. It made sense." "You didn't mention any of this to me." She paused. He watched her consider that, not defensively, but seriously, the way she considered most things. "You're right," she said. "I should have. I got moving and I didn't stop to keep you informed." She looked at him directly. "I'm sorry for that." It was the first time she'd apologized for anything. He wasn't sure what to do with it. "All right," he said, "I'll keep you in it from here on." "I'd appreciate that." A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable. The evening light came through the west window and laid itself across the table in the familiar way it did at this hour. And Gideon found himself looking at his wife. His wife. A word that still felt like a new boot he hadn't broken in yet, and thinking that this was what she was. Not what he'd sent for, not what he'd imagined, but something real, something that had arrived in this house and taken root, the same way those first seeds had taken root in soil that had been waiting under gravel for 25 years. "The flower situation," Miriam said. "Back to business." He almost smiled. "What about it?" Caldwell raised his price again, 2 cents a pound. Gideon set his fork down. "When?" "This week." Cecilia heard from the dry goods man. She folded her hands on the table. "We're going through almost 20 pounds a week now with the bread operation. At his new price, that eats into everything." "He does that," Gideon said. Not with approval, just as a fact. Magnus Caldwell had been raising and adjusting prices for years, and there was no real recourse because there was no real alternative. He had the only working mill within any reasonable distance, and he had railroad contracts that gave him first claim on most of the regional grain supply. People complained about him the way they complained about weather, steadily and without expectation that it would help. "I wrote a letter," Miriam said. "To who?" She reached across to the shelf behind her and handed him a folded piece of paper. He opened it. It was an inquiry addressed to a grain mill in Salina, about 80 miles east near the rail hub, asking about their flour prices, their minimum order quantities, and whether they could arrange transport. It was well written, professional even. No wasted words. He looked up at her. "This is a long way to source flour. If their price is low enough and the rail freight is reasonable, the math still works." She took the letter back. "I don't know that yet. That's why I'm asking." "You haven't sent it." "I wanted to tell you first." He thought about it for a moment. Magnus Caldwell was not a man who took well to competition or being worked around. He had a long memory and a wide reach and a personality that ran toward retaliation. Going around him for flour supply was the kind of thing that got noticed. "Send it," Gideon said. The response from the Salina mill came back in 10 days, and the price was better than Caldwell's by a meaningful margin, even with freight. Miriam wrote back confirming a first order. She arranged with the station master in Harlan Creek for the delivery. A quiet transaction, not announced. She was careful that way. She didn't advertise what she was doing before she'd done it. She'd noticed, Gideon thought, that words got out in this town at a speed that was sometimes inconvenient. The first delivery came in on a Thursday morning, 50 pounds of flour in 2 cloth sacks, and Miriam had Alma help her carry them to the pantry. They were in and stored before noon, nothing dramatic about it. But Harv Pickett had been at the station for unrelated business that morning, and Harv Pickett talked, and by Friday afternoon the information had reached, among other people, Magnus Caldwell. Among shuts. Gideon was at the dry goods store when he heard the name spoken in a tone that made him slow down near the counter without making it obvious he was listening. Caldwell's name came up the way it always did, not loudly, the way you'd say the name of someone you were comfortable discussing, but low and sideways, the way people mention a weather system they can see coming but can't stop. He was asking about the Mercer place. The dry goods man, a nervous fellow named Albert Sims, was saying to someone Gideon didn't recognize, about who they're buying flour from now. The other man said something Gideon couldn't catch. "All I know is he didn't look pleased," Sims said. Gideon bought his nails and went home. He told Miriam at supper. She listened without interrupting, which was her habit. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment, looking at her plate. "Good," she said. He blinked. "Good?" "If he's asking questions, it means he noticed." She picked up her fork. "Men like that only notice things that threaten them." "That's not necessarily a good thing, Miriam. It means we're doing something that matters." She looked at him steadily, the way she always did when she was saying something she'd already thought through. He was going to notice eventually. Might as well be now while we're still small enough that he thinks we're not worth the trouble. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. "And if he decides we are worth the trouble?" She held his gaze and didn't flinch from the question. "Then we'll have been smart enough to be ready," she said. Outside, the evening wind was moving through the garden beds in long, slow waves, and the produce table at the gate was empty for the night, and somewhere on the road toward town, Gideon thought, a man with a wider reach than either of them had yet fully reckoned with was sitting with a thought about the Mercer ranch that hadn't finished forming yet. But the bread was rising in the kitchen. The jar on the shelf was heavier every week, and the women who came and went through the gate with soil on their hands and produce in their arms were building something together that had started as a single bowl of hard-boiled eggs on a warped pine table, and was becoming, quietly and without anyone's permission, something that couldn't easily be undone. Magnus Caldwell did not come himself. That was the first thing. Men like Magnus Caldwell rarely delivered their own messages when the message was meant to threaten. They sent representatives, someone official-looking enough to be taken seriously, but disposable enough that the man himself could claim distance if things went wrong. What arrived at the Mercer gate on a Wednesday morning in early June was a fellow named Price, who worked as Caldwell's business agent, a lean, Precise man in his 50s with a good coat and bad eyes that moved around a room before the rest of him did. Miriam was at the produce table when Price came up the road. She'd been retying the canvas cover that had come loose in the previous night's wind. She saw him coming from a distance and had him read by the time he reached the gate. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, which meant he'd done his research. "Mr. She left the name open. "Price. I represent Mr. Magnus Caldwell." He said it the way people say the names of institutions, not individuals. Like the man and the entity around him were the same thing. "I was hoping to speak with your husband." "He's working." She folded the loose corner of canvas back and anchored it with a stone. "You can speak with me." Price looked at her with the faint, managed patience of a man who had been in many conversations where this happened and had learned not to show what he thought about it. "Of course," he said. "Mr. Caldwell wanted to convey his regards. He's been hearing good things about the operation here." "That's kind," Miriam said. "He's also a little concerned." Price folded his hands in front of him. "He understands you've been sourcing flour from outside the county." "We have. Mr. Caldwell has supplied this region for a long time. He has relationships, obligations." A small pause. "He'd prefer to keep the local supply chain intact." Miriam looked at him. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means he'd appreciate if you'd consider coming back to his mill. He's prepared to discuss pricing." She was quiet for a moment, and Gideon, who had heard voices from the north fence and come around the side of the house to see, watched his wife stand at the gate with her hands at her sides and her face giving away nothing. "Tell Mr. Caldwell we're satisfied with our current arrangement," she said, "but we appreciate him reaching out." Something shifted behind Price's careful expression. "Mrs. Mercer, I don't think you fully understand the scope of Mr. Caldwell's reach in this county. He works with most of the suppliers you're likely to depend on. He has a long relationship with the railroad provisioning office." "I understand," she said. "Thank you for coming by." Price stood at the gate for a moment like a man trying to decide whether to push harder. He decided against it, straightened his coat, nodded, and walked back up the road the way he'd come. Gideon waited until he was out of earshot. "What was that?" he said. "A warning," Miriam said. She turned from the gate and walked toward the house, and he fell in beside her. Polite enough that he can say later he was just making conversation. "Caldwell's talking about the railroad provisioning," Gideon said. He felt the weight of that, the specific gravity of it. The railroad provisioning contract for this section of line was not a small thing. It was a supply agreement for bread, hardtack, preserved goods, and basic produce to feed the construction and maintenance crews working the regional routes. It was renewed annually, and the contract value was more money than most small operations saw in 3 years. "I know," Miriam said. "We're nowhere near that scale." "Not yet." He stopped walking. She took 2 more steps before she noticed and turned back to look at him. He stared at her. "Miriam, the provisioning contract is—" "I know what it is." She was patient, but there was something underneath the patience, a restrained urgency that she kept buttoned down most of the time. "I'm not saying we apply for it tomorrow. I'm saying Caldwell's worried we might, eventually. And worried men do things before they're necessary." "What things?" She looked at him for a moment without answering, and in the space of that pause he understood that she already had a sense of what was coming, had already been turning it over, had already begun calculating for it. That was the thing about her that he still hadn't entirely gotten used to. She was usually 2 steps ahead, and she didn't always announce it. "Things that make it harder for us to operate," she said finally. "We should pay attention." But the first thing that happened was the egg supplier. They'd been buying extra laying hens from a man named Sorrel who kept a poultry operation 2 farms over. Nothing formal. He'd sell a bird here, a half dozen there, and Miriam had been steadily building the flock to keep up with the bread and egg demand at the stand. Sorrel sent word through his son that he wouldn't be selling anymore. No explanation, just done. When Gideon rode over to ask about it, Sorrel was in his yard and wouldn't quite meet his eyes. "Just a business decision," he said. "No hard feelings." Gideon came home and told Miriam. She nodded slowly. "What does Sorrel owe Caldwell?" she asked. Gideon thought about it. "There's a loan from 2 winters back when Sorrel's barn burned. Caldwell fronted him money to rebuild." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "Right," she said. "The second thing was the dry goods store. Albert Sims, who'd always been pleasant enough in a nervous, overly agreeable way, started being unavailable when Miriam came in for staples. Not obviously, nothing you could point to. Just suddenly always busy with other customers, or out of certain items she needed, or slower to help than he used to be. She came home one Thursday having spent twice as long in town as it should have taken for a simple supply run, and set her bags on the table with a controlled quietness that Gideon had learned to recognize as the outer edge of her frustration. "Sims didn't have baking powder," she said. "He had baking powder on the shelf while he was telling me he didn't have baking powder." "You sure?" She looked at him. "Right," he said. "Caldwell." The third thing was the rumor. Harv Pickett had always been reliably useless, but he'd previously been useless in a general, unfocused way. Now his uselessness had acquired a direction. By mid-June, there was a story moving through Harlan Creek that the Mercer operation was selling produce that had been watered with runoff from the livestock pens. Unsanitary, Harv was saying to anyone who'd listen, and you couldn't see it, but you could taste it if you knew what to look for. It was a specific lie, the kind that's difficult to disprove because it operates on suggestion rather than evidence. And it had teeth. 2 of the rail crew workers stopped coming by. A woman who'd been a reliable Thursday customer didn't show for 3 weeks. Cecilia Drummond showed up on a Saturday morning with the expression of a woman who had something to say and had decided to say it. She found Miriam in the garden and came through the gate and stood at the end of the bean row with her arms crossed. "I heard what Harv's been putting around," she said. Miriam looked up from what she was doing. "So did I. It's garbage. Anyone who's seen this garden knows it." Cecilia's voice had a practical anger in it, the kind that comes from someone who has seen this kind of thing before and has no patience left for it. "But people talk, and then other people listen, and then—" She made a gesture with her hand. "You know how it goes." "I know," Miriam said. "What are you going to do about it?" Miriam sat back on her heels and looked at the garden beds. The careful rows, the staked beans, the tomatoes coming in, the soil that she knew the composition of better than she knew most things about this town. She'd built this. Not alone, but she'd started it and kept it, and she knew every inch of it. "Invite people to see it," she said. Cecilia frowned. "What? If the question is whether this garden is clean and well run, the answer is to let people see it for themselves." She stood up and brushed the soil off her knees. "Not through the fence, through the gate. Show them." Cecilia was quiet for a moment, turning that over. "A lot of folks won't come." "Some will." Miriam looked at her directly. "Will you help me get the word out?" The open morning happened on a Thursday, 10 days later. Miriam had spent those 10 days doing what she always did, working the garden, keeping the bread baking, running the stand, but also sending word through Cecilia and Dot and Ruth to the women and families they knew, inviting people to come by the Mercer place between 9 and noon, see the operation, and ask questions. She'd also quietly written a letter to the county inspector's office in Salina asking whether there was a process for having a produce operation voluntarily inspected and documented. The response had come back in 8 days. Yes, such a process existed, and a field inspector could be arranged with sufficient notice. She'd written back scheduling one for the following month. She didn't tell Gideon about the inspector letter until a week after she'd sent it. He stared at her across the kitchen table. "You already wrote it." "I wasn't sure it would work out. I didn't want to raise expectations." She paused. "Are you angry?" He thought about it. He had a right to be. It was a significant thing to arrange without discussing. But he looked at the letter and at his wife and tried to locate real anger inside him, and mostly found irritation, and underneath that something that felt closer to admiration, which was not a comfortable thing to feel about being consistently outmaneuvered. "Tell me next time," he said. "Yes," she said. "I will." 14 people came on the Thursday morning. Not a huge number, but they were the right people. Women from 3 neighboring farms, the wife of the station master, 2 men who worked the rail crew and whose wives had sent them to look, Delbert Foss, who showed up without being invited because he showed up everywhere. Miriam walked them through it herself. She didn't make speeches. She showed them the beds, explained the water source, demonstrated the distance from the livestock pen on the east side. She answered questions plainly and without defensiveness, and let the garden speak most of what needed to be said. The soil was dark and clean, The plants were healthy. The operation was what it looked like, a well-run kitchen garden, scaled up through work and will, and a group of women who'd decided that someone else's fear of their success was not their problem. Delbert stood near the gate at the end, watching people leave, and said to Gideon in a low voice, "She knows what she's doing." "I know," Gideon said. "You knew that before this." He hadn't wanted to make it into a thing, so he just nodded. Caldwell came himself 2 days later. He arrived in a good carriage with a driver, which meant he wanted to be seen arriving. Magnus Caldwell was in his 60s, broad through the chest and shoulders, with white hair that he wore short, and a face that had the particular set of a man who had been right about most things for most of his life, and had been rewarded for it financially enough that his certainty had become indistinguishable from fact in his own mind. He got down from the carriage and walked to the gate with his hat in his hand, which was a performance of manners so obvious that Gideon almost felt embarrassed watching it. Gideon met him at the gate. Miriam stood slightly behind his shoulder. "Gideon," Caldwell said, like they were friends. They were not friends. They were the kind of neighbors who existed in civil, wary proximity because they had to. "Nice to see you. And Mrs. Mercer." He nodded at Miriam with the expression of a man acknowledging a piece of furniture that has somehow begun making decisions. "Mr. Caldwell," she said. He looked past them at the garden and the stand and the general evidence of an operation that was going well. Something moved behind his eyes. Not shock, he was too controlled for that, but a recalibration. He'd expected more damage than he saw, Gideon thought. Price and Sims and Harv Pickett had apparently been less effective than he'd counted on. "I came to speak plainly," Caldwell said. "I think we've gotten off on a bad foot, and I'd like to correct that." "I'd be glad to hear that," Gideon said carefully. "I've got a relationship with this county that goes back 30 years. He said it without aggression, as a statement of fact, the way you'd cite a property record. "What happens here matters to me. I want the region to do well. I want operations like yours to do well." He looked between them. "But I also need to protect what I've built. That's only natural." "Of course," Miriam said. "I'm prepared to offer you a preferred pricing agreement, below current market, stable for 18 months. He let that sit for a moment. "In exchange, you buy flour exclusively through my mill. You don't go to Selena." The air between them was still. A bee was working one of the bean flowers. Somewhere behind the house, one of the hens complained about something. Gideon kept his face neutral and glanced at Miriam. She was looking at Caldwell with her direct, measuring expression. "That's a generous offer," she said. Caldwell nodded, as if that settled it. "We'll need a couple of days to think about it," she said. Something shifted in Caldwell's face. Not anger, but a recalibration of his expectations about how easy this was going to be. "Of course," he said smoothly. "Take your time." He replaced his hat. "I'll wait to hear from you." He walked back to the carriage, and the driver took him back up the road. Gideon waited until the carriage was past the bend. "You're not going to take it." "No," she said. "You could have just told him that." "I could have." She turned and walked toward the house. "But now he thinks we're weighing it, and while he thinks we're weighing it, he's not doing the next thing he was planning." He followed her inside. "What's the next thing?" She sat down at the table and pulled a piece of paper from the shelf. The same shelf where the coin jar lived, which was heavy now, heavier than either of them had expected 3 months ago. The paper had some figures on it in her handwriting. He sat across from her and she turned it toward him. It was a breakdown of the railroad provisioning contract. Not the full contract. She didn't have that. But what she'd been able to find out about it from conversations with the station master's wife, from the rail crew workers who'd become regulars, from a letter she'd sent to the regional rail office asking about their food supply requirements for the upcoming year. She'd assembled it piece by piece over the past month, the way she assembled most things. He stared at it. "When did you put this together?" "Over time," she said. "The contract comes up for renewal in September. Caldwell's held it for 6 years. The rail company has been dissatisfied with the last 2 delivery cycles, quality issues, late deliveries. They haven't said so publicly, but..." She tapped one section of the paper. "The station master's wife hears things. And you're thinking we should bid for it." "I'm thinking we should be ready to bid for it." She looked at him steadily. "That's different. We're not there yet. We might not be there by September, but if Caldwell knows we're thinking about it, if he thinks that's where this is headed, Then he stops playing defense and goes on offense, so I don't want him to know yet. Gideon leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, and then at his wife. "You've been planning this since the flower letter," he said. It wasn't a question. "Since Price came to the gate," she said, which was more honest than he'd expected. He thought about everything that had happened. The open morning, the inspector letter, the careful way she'd handled Caldwell just now, the information she'd assembled about a contract she'd never mentioned. He thought about the woman who had arrived with a trunk and a canvas bag and started tearing up the front yard before the dust settled, and he tried to trace the line from that woman to this one and found it was one continuous line, no break in it anywhere. "If we go after the provisioning contract," he said slowly, "and we lose, we've made an enemy of a man who has 30 years of reach in this county. If we do nothing and he keeps squeezing," she said, "we're out of business in a year anyway. He won't stop at flower prices and Harv Pickett rumors." She met his eyes. "You know that." He did know it. He'd known it somewhere under everything else for the past several weeks. Caldwell's visit today had not been an olive branch. It had been a territorial marking. The preferred pricing offer was a leash, and 18 months on a leash was just a longer way of being on a leash. "So we get ready," he said. "We get ready," she agreed. Outside, the afternoon was turning long and golden, the way Kansas afternoons did in June, the light going sideways through everything and making the garden look like something from a painting. The bean rows were full. The tomatoes were coming in red. The table at the gate needed restocking, and there were 4 dozen eggs waiting in the larder and enough bread dough rising in the kitchen to fill a second shelf. Gideon looked at all of it through the window and thought about September, about the gap between what they were and what they would need to be, about the weight of what Miriam was carrying in her head with all those figures and letters and carefully assembled information, and then thought about what she'd said on her very first morning here, on her knees in the gravel with soil coming up dark under her hands. "You've got it buried under decorative rock." She'd seen it then. She'd seen more than the garden, more than the eggs and the bread and the produce stand. She'd seen the whole shape of the thing, or at least a shape that could become the thing if they worked hard enough and were smart enough and didn't get flattened before they had the chance. He wasn't entirely sure they could do it. He had the particular doubt of a man who has lived a long time on the edge of getting by and has learned not to want too loudly because wanting loudly was a fast way to get hurt. But he was also looking at a garden that hadn't existed 4 months ago, and a wife who had appeared in his life sideways, by paperwork and necessity, and had immediately begun making things out of what he thought was nothing. He supposed he could keep up. "We're going to need more hens," he said. Miriam looked at him, and there was something in her face, not quite a smile or maybe exactly a smile, just not the obvious kind, and she nodded. "I'll write to a farm east of Salina," she said. "They don't owe Caldwell anything." They sent their answer to Caldwell on a Monday. A short, polite letter declining the exclusive arrangement, written in Miriam's hand but signed by both of them. Gideon had read it twice before she sealed it, changed one word, then changed it back to what she'd had originally. She watched him do this without comment. "It's fine," he said, handing it back. "I know," she said. She sealed it. They didn't talk much about what came after. They didn't need to. Both of them understood that a letter like that, delivered to a man like Magnus Caldwell, was not the end of a conversation. It was the beginning of a different kind. What came after was 3 weeks of quiet that had the particular quality of quiet that sits just before something breaks. The county inspector arrived on a Tuesday morning in late July, a youngish man named Ferris, who wore a formal coat that was too heavy for the weather and carried a leather-bound record book and seemed slightly surprised to find an operation as organized as the one he walked into. Miriam had been ready for him. She walked him through every section: the beds, the water source, the storage, the laying operation, the bread kitchen, and answered every question he asked with specific, factual answers and produced documentation for the things he wanted documentation for because she'd been keeping records since the 2nd month. Yields by bed, by week, egg counts, bread quantities, supply sources. Ferris wrote in his book for a long time. "Mrs. Mercer," he said at one point, standing in the East Garden looking at her records, "did you set this documentation system up with an inspection in mind?" "I set it up because I like to know what I'm doing and why," she said. The inspection was separate. He wrote something. She didn't ask what. When he left, He told her the formal report would be filed with the county record office within 30 days, and she could request a copy. She thanked him, and after his wagon was out of sight, she sat down on the porch steps and let out a long, slow breath that she hadn't quite allowed herself while he was there. Gideon was watching her from the doorway. "How do you think it went?" "Fine," she said. "Probably fine." She pressed her hands together in her lap. "I won't know until I see the report." "But your sense of it?" She looked out at the garden. "Fine," she said again, quieter. He went and sat beside her on the steps, which was not something he did often, just sitting without a task. They sat without talking for a while, in the thick July heat, and somewhere in the bean rows a grasshopper made its dry mechanical noise. "I sent the inquiry to the railroad office," she said. He'd been expecting it, but it still landed with weight. "When?" 2 weeks ago." She looked at him sidelong. "Before you say it, I know. I should have told you." "You should have told me." "I wanted to know if there was a realistic path before I raised it." She turned to face him more squarely. "The contract inquiry goes to a regional office in Wichita. It's not Caldwell's local territory. They publish a notice when the current contract approaches renewal and accept formal bids from qualified operations." "And are we qualified?" She was quiet for a moment. "We will be, if we spend the next 6 weeks building the numbers." She had the folded paper in her apron pocket. He'd come to recognize it as the provisioning paper, the one with all the figures, which she apparently carried now. She didn't take it out. "The contract minimum is a consistent supply of bread, dried goods, and preserved produce sufficient for crews of 20 to 40 men per active work section. 3 sections on our regional line." Gideon did the arithmetic in his head, slowly. That's a significant output." "It is. We can't do that alone." "No," she said. "We can't." Another silence. He looked at the garden, at the gate, at the road beyond it that the rail crew came down twice a week. He thought about Cecilia Drummond and Dot Hensley and Ruth Blanchard and Alma, the quiet girl with careful hands who'd started as a weeder and could now manage the bread production by herself on the days Miriam needed to be elsewhere. "You're thinking about the women," he said. "I've already talked to them," Miriam said. He turned and looked at her. "Cecilia's got a full kitchen and 3 daughters old enough to bake. Dot's root cellar is better than ours, and she can handle preservation. She's been doing it anyway for the overflow. Ruth has space in the old section barn she's not using, and she's willing to convert it to dry storage." She paused. "Alma wants to be paid in cash now, not kind." "That's fair," he said. "I thought so too." She looked at him steadily. "Gideon, I know I did this out of order again. I know I go ahead and then tell you." She stopped, started again, more carefully. "I'm working on it. I get moving, and it becomes hard to stop because if I stop, I start thinking about all the ways it could fail, and—" She cut herself off. He'd never heard her get that close to the inside of herself before. She usually kept whatever was underneath her moving, very tightly managed. "I should have told you. I'm telling you now." He looked at his wife for a moment. This woman who had arrived as a stranger 5 months ago and upended every quiet, settled thing in his life, and was now sitting beside him on his porch telling him, in her oblique, practical way, that she was afraid. "We'll need a contract with each of them," he said. "Written, fair, specific. If we're going to do this, we do it right." Something released in her face. Not dramatically. It was a small thing, the slight easing of a tension that had been there a long time. "I've drafted something," she said. "Of course you have," he said, and this time he did smile, and she did too, briefly, and it was the first time they'd smiled at the same thing at the same time, and it felt like something, though neither of them said so. July became August in the grinding way that Kansas summers moved. Heat that didn't apologize, air that sat heavy on everything, dust that found its way into every closed space. The garden needed twice daily watering, and Miriam reorganized the schedule to get it done in the early morning and the last hour of daylight when the temperature dropped fractionally from oppressive to merely difficult. The bid preparation took shape over those weeks in the evenings, after supper, at the kitchen table. Miriam had the figures. Gideon had the practical knowledge of what was actually possible, how much they could produce, how much the cooperative network could handle, what the transport timing looked like given the rail schedule. They worked well together at this, in a way that had taken months to develop and didn't have a name yet. She'd bring numbers. He'd push back where they were optimistic. She'd adjust. He'd find a problem she hadn't thought of. She'd solve it, back and forth. Not always without friction. There were evenings when he said something was impossible, and she said it wasn't, and they sat on opposite sides of a disagreement for half an hour before one of them gave ground. And it wasn't always the same one, but they worked. Cecilia came over 3 evenings that August with her oldest daughter, a solid, quiet girl of 17 named Frances, and sat at the same table going over output projections. Dot Hensley came once and spent 2 hours with Miriam going through her preservation process and what quantities she could reliably sustain. Ruth sent a written note with her storage dimensions and a calculation of how much additional shelving she could install. Alma showed up one Saturday morning before anyone else was up and started on the bread without being asked, and when Miriam came downstairs and found her, already an hour in, flour on her arms and 4 loaves shaped and in the pans, Miriam stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and then went to start the coffee without saying anything sentimental. It was not a smooth operation. Things went wrong constantly in the small, grinding ways that things go wrong when you're building something faster than it naturally wants to be built. 2 of the new hens died within a week of arrival. Disease, probably carried from wherever they'd come from. The Selena flour shipment ran 2 days late in early August, and Miriam spent those 2 days rationing what they had and recalculating the bread output with a controlled tension that made Gideon step carefully around her. Ruth's barn conversion hit a problem with the floor joists. They were rotted further than anyone had realized, and the dry storage space was delayed by 3 weeks, while a carpenter came out and rebuilt the section. None of it broke them, but it cost time and money and energy, and the bid deadline was September 15th, and by the 1st of September, the margin between what they could reliably demonstrate and what the contract required was thinner than Miriam let on at the kitchen table. Gideon knew anyway. He'd been watching the numbers close enough to read what she wasn't saying. The news about Caldwell's bid came from the station master's wife, Vera Ludlow, who had become something of a quiet information source over the past months. Not from any explicit arrangement, but because she talked to Miriam when she came to the produce stand, and Vera talked to everyone and therefore knew most things. Vera came by the stand on a Thursday in the 2nd week of September and waited until the other customers were gone. "He's filed," she told Miriam, low and direct. "Caldwell. His bid went into the regional office 3 days ago." "Do you know what he's proposing?" "Not specifically, but Vera," she corrected herself, "but my husband says the supply volumes are, well, they're larger than what the contract asks, significantly." Miriam looked at her. "He's trying to set a number they can't match," Vera said, "a supply commitment that makes everyone else look insufficient by comparison." Miriam was quiet for a moment. "Is there any way your husband could find out whether the regional office has any concerns about Caldwell's current performance from the last cycle?" Vera seemed unsurprised by the question, which suggested she'd already been thinking along those lines. "He said," she lowered her voice further, though there was no one nearby. "He said the quality complaints from the last delivery cycle were documented internally. The rail company keeps records. Would those records be available to someone submitting a competing bid as evidence of prior performance issues?" Vera held her gaze steadily. If someone knew to ask for them through the right channel. She took a longer route home from the stand that day, but it wasn't really about the route. Miriam sat at the kitchen table that night with the provisioning paper, which had been amended and re-amended so many times the margins were full of her notations in 3 different inks. Gideon sat across from her. The lamp was turned up, and the moths were battering themselves against the window glass in the August night. "Caldwell's bid is inflated," she said. "What do you mean?" "He's proposing supply quantities he can't sustain to make other bids look insufficient." She tapped the paper. "It's smart. If no one checks his actual output against his claim, the number wins. And if someone checks, then his bid is fraudulent. And a fraudulent bid on a public provisioning contract is a legal matter, not just a business one." She looked up. "He knows no one usually checks because he's held this contract for 6 years, and the regional office trusts the pattern." Gideon leaned forward. "Do we have any actual evidence of what he can or can't produce?" Not directly, she paused. But the quality complaints are on record. If I can get the regional office to cross-reference his claim capacity against his delivery record from the last 2 cycles, she stopped. The math won't hold up. How do we get them to cross-reference? We request it. She looked at him, formally. As part of our bid submission, we note that we are a new and smaller operation, and we ask that the regional office apply consistent standards of scrutiny to all bids, including documentation of each bidder's prior performance record. He stared at her. You're asking them to audit him. I'm asking them to apply the same standards to everyone, which they should be doing anyway. She met his eyes. Gideon, I need you to understand. If we submit this bid and we request this scrutiny and Caldwell finds out we did it, there is no going back to polite distance. He will know we're the reason his bid got examined. I know that. I want to make sure. Miriam, he held her gaze. I know. Send the bid. She nodded once, pulled a fresh piece of paper from the shelf. The bid went to the Wichita Regional Office on September 10th, 5 days before the deadline. It was 41 pages. Miriam had written most of it in the final 2 weeks of August, with Gideon's input on the logistical sections and a careful review by both of them of every number before it was committed to ink. The request for consistent scrutiny of all bidders was on page 3, worded carefully. Professional, not accusatory. She'd rewritten that section 6 times. They sent it by rail courier, which cost more than the post but was faster and required a signed confirmation of delivery. The confirmation came back in 2 days. Received, logged. Then they waited, which was its own kind of work. The first sign that something had shifted came from an unexpected direction. Harv Pickett had been quiet for most of August, unusually so, which was itself a kind of signal that someone had told him to stand down, probably because his previous efforts had produced the open morning and the inspector visit, neither of which had helped Caldwell's position. But on the 3rd Thursday of September, Miriam was in the dry goods store, Albert Sims having thawed somewhat now that the summer had passed without the Mercer operation collapsing, and she heard Harv's voice from the back of the store, talking to someone she couldn't see. Heard the regional boys are coming out to look at the Mercer place. Inspection team. Where'd you hear that? Around. A pause. Caldwell's not happy about it. Miriam bought her staples and went home. She told Gideon. He sat with it for a moment. An inspection team from the regional office isn't bad for us, he said. No, she said. It isn't. The inspection team arrived on a Wednesday. There were 2 of them. A formal man named Graves, who seemed to have been dispatched from the Wichita office with a specific checklist, and a younger woman named Holt, who was there, apparently, in some capacity related to documentation. They arrived in the morning, unannounced, which Miriam suspected was deliberate, to see the operation in its actual state rather than a prepared state. They found it running. Alma was on bread. Cecilia's daughter Frances had come over that morning because it was a delivery prep day and there were crates to be packed. Ruth Blanchard was in the storage section doing an inventory. Dot Hensley was at the table at the gate, managing the morning customers from the rail crew. Graves walked through with his checklist, and Miriam walked with him and answered every question without rushing and without embellishment. He asked about the supply network. She pulled out the contracts with Cecilia, Dot, Ruth, and Alma. Written, signed, specific, exactly as Gideon had said they should be. He asked about transport. She showed him the arrangement with the station master for delivery scheduling. He asked about prior output. She handed him the records she'd kept since the 2nd month. He looked at them for a long time. These are detailed, he said. I like knowing what I'm doing, she said, which was exactly what she'd told the county inspector in July, because it was exactly true. Holt, the younger woman, was writing notes of her own on a separate pad. At one point she looked up and caught Miriam's eye and gave a small, unperformative nod that meant something, but was professional enough to mean nothing officially. Graves and Holt left in the early afternoon. They didn't say what their report would contain. They weren't obligated to, and Miriam didn't ask. What she did ask that evening at the kitchen table was something she hadn't asked before. What happens to this place, she said, if we don't get the contract? Gideon looked at her. It was the first time she'd asked a question that went in that direction. We keep going, he said. The stand's profitable now. We have the cooperative. I know we keep going, she said. That's not what I'm asking. She looked at him directly. I'm asking what it does to you. He was quiet for a moment because he wasn't used to being asked that, and because the honest answer required him to go somewhere he didn't often go. I've been almost gone from this place twice, he said finally. Once when my father died and left debt. Once after Clara. He looked at the table. Both times I stayed because there was nowhere else to be and not enough money to leave, and because I kept thinking there was something here worth keeping. I couldn't always see it, but I thought it was there. Miriam was listening without expression, which was how she listened when she was listening most carefully. You came here and saw it, he said, even under the gravel. He looked up at her. If we don't get the contract, I'll be disappointed. But I already know the land is worth keeping. He paused. You showed me that. She was quiet for a long moment. He watched something move across her face that she usually kept where it couldn't be seen. Something tired and certain and human. I haven't always been sure I made the right decision, she said. Coming here. It was a practical choice. I needed somewhere to go, and you had land and sounded like a man who wouldn't be cruel. She looked at her hands on the table. That's not much of a foundation. No, he said honestly. But you never once tried to make me smaller, she said. When I moved fast and didn't tell you things, you were frustrated, but you never told me to stop. You kept up. She looked at him. That turned out to be what mattered. He didn't say anything for a moment. The lamplight was doing what it did at this hour, going soft and wide across everything. Yeah, he said. I suppose it did. Outside, the night insects were running their full late summer chorus, and somewhere down the road toward town, a dog was barking at something it would never catch. The jar on the shelf was heavier than it had ever been. The garden was still going. The fall crops were in, the turnips and the last of the beans and the winter squash coming fat and orange on the fence. And through the window it was dark and quiet, and everything was simply itself, the same land it had always been, neither more nor less than what it was. But what it was had changed. Neither of them said that. They didn't have to. They sat at the kitchen table in the house that had been a lonely place for a long time, and was not that anymore. And they waited, without performing the waiting, for whatever came next. The letter from the Wichita Regional Office arrived on a Friday. It came with the Morning Post, tucked between a seed catalog and a notice about road repair on the county line, which seemed like the wrong kind of company for something that had taken 6 months of their lives to build toward. Gideon brought it in from the gate and set it on the kitchen table in front of Miriam, who was standing at the stove with a dish towel in her hands, and they both looked at it for a moment without touching it. Go ahead, he said. She picked it up and opened it. She read it once, all the way through, without her expression changing. Then she set it down flat on the table and put her hands on either side of it and read it again. Well, he said. She looked up at him. We got it. He stood there. He'd been braced for the other answer. He realized that now, felt the bracing come off him like something physical. We got the full contract? 1 year provisional, with option to renew pending first quarter performance review. She tapped the paper. Full supply commitment, all 3 work sections. She paused. Caldwell's bid was disqualified. Gideon pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. Disqualified. His claimed output capacity was inconsistent with his documented delivery record from the prior 2 cycles. She was reading from the letter now. The regional office found material discrepancies and determined the bid did not meet the standard for factual accuracy required under the provisioning agreement. She set the letter down. He inflated his numbers by almost 40%. Once they actually checked, Gideon was quiet for a moment. He'd been doing that for years, probably. Probably, she said. Nobody checked before. Neither of them said anything for a while. Outside, Alma was already at work. They could hear her moving around in the bread kitchen, which was what they'd started calling the lean-to addition Gideon had built on the east side of the house over August. A second baking space with 2 ovens and a long wooden work table that Alma had immediately colonized as her own domain. The morning smelled like wood smoke and proving dough. Gideon looked at the letter, then at his wife. You asked them to check. I asked them to apply consistent standards, she said, which was accurate and also not quite the whole thing. Miriam. She met his eyes. I asked them to check, she said. Yes. He nodded slowly. He wasn't angry. He was past being angry about her moving ahead of him, had made his peace with it somewhere in August, mostly because the alternative was being angry constantly, and he didn't have the energy for that. What he felt instead was something more complicated, a reluctant, grounded admiration for a woman who had looked at a man with 30 years of entrenched power and found the exact mechanism by which he could be undone, and then used it cleanly, without drama. With 41 pages and a formal letter. "I need to tell the others," she said. She was already reaching for her coat. "Ouch," Cecilia cried, which surprised everyone, including Cecilia. She was standing in her own kitchen when Miriam told her, and she put one hand flat on the table and pressed her mouth together, and the tears came anyway, and she looked furious at herself for it. "Stop looking at me," she said to Miriam. "I'm not looking at you," Miriam said, which was a small lie, kindly offered. Cecilia pressed her apron to her face briefly. "My husband told me this was foolish, spending time over at your place. He said nothing was going to come of it." She lowered the apron. Her eyes were red, but her voice was steady. "He said that in June." "What does he say now?" Miriam asked. "A beat. He's been asking when the first payment comes in." Miriam almost smiled. "October, if we start the first delivery cycle on schedule." Cecilia made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but came from the same place. "Then I suppose he'll have opinions about that too." She looked at Miriam squarely. "You know what you did for this place, not just for your ranch, for all of us." "We did it," Miriam said. "You and Dot and Ruth and Alma. The bid was 41 pages, and at least 15 of them were your output numbers. You wrote the pages. You gave me the numbers to put in them." Cecilia looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who wants to argue and knows they won't win. "Fine," she said. "We did it." She straightened up and pulled her apron flat again. "When do we start?" Dot Hensley heard the news and went immediately practical, which was her way of handling things that moved her. Within 10 minutes of Miriam telling her, she was talking about the root cellar expansion she'd been wanting to do and whether October's first payment could cover the lumber. Ruth Blanchard said almost nothing. She stood in the doorway of her storage barn, the one with the new floor joists, solid now and smelling of fresh wood, and listened to Miriam and then looked around the space she'd built with the money she'd earned from overflow storage and said quietly, "My husband would have told me this was too much to hope for." "Is that why you came anyway?" Miriam asked. Ruth thought about it. "I came because you asked me and I didn't have much to lose." She looked at Miriam. "Turns out I had more to gain than I knew." Alma was last. Miriam found her in the bread kitchen, because that was where Alma usually was at this hour, and she told her straight. The contract, the terms, the payment structure going forward. Alma was 18, or close to it, and she had the particular self-containment of someone who had learned early that things don't always come through, and had developed the habit of not showing how much she wanted them to. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When Miriam finished, Alma looked at the loaves in the pan in front of her for a moment. Then she said, "Does this mean I get the cash wage starting in October?" "Starting October 1st, Miriam said. Alma nodded once and turned back to her bread. Miriam watched her for a moment and saw the small adjustment in her shoulders. Something releasing, some held-in thing going loose, and left her to it. Magnus Caldwell did not take the disqualification quietly, which no one had expected him to. The first version of his response was a formal complaint filed with the regional office in Wichita, arguing that the scrutiny applied to his bid had been unfairly solicited by a competing bidder and constituted an improper interference in the procurement process. The regional office took 11 days to review the complaint and rejected it, noting that the request for consistent scrutiny was procedurally appropriate and that the discrepancies identified in Caldwell's bid existed independently of who had requested the review. The second version was a conversation that Caldwell apparently had with the county commissioner, which filtered back through enough people that its rough shape was knowable, even without a direct account. He'd argued that the Mercer operation was too small and too new to be trusted with a contract of this size, that it was a risk to the rail company, that a woman running a cooperative of farm wives out of converted barns was not a serious provisioning operation. The commissioner, whose wife had been buying produce from the Mercer stand since July, and whose opinion of Magnus Caldwell had apparently been declining for several years for reasons having nothing to do with the current situation, was understood to have listened politely and said very little. The third version was Caldwell coming to the gate himself. He arrived on a Saturday morning in early October without the carriage this time. He drove his own wagon, which was either an accident or a statement, and pulled up at the fence and looked at the operation, which had changed since June. There were 3 wagons parked in the side yard belonging to Cecilia, Dot, and Ruth, who were all there for the first major delivery prep cycle. Francis was carrying crates from the bread kitchen. Alma was directing traffic near the storage section. The produce stand had been expanded again, now a proper covered structure with Gideon's name on a small painted sign at the corner. Caldwell sat in his wagon for a long moment looking at all of it. Gideon saw him first and walked over. Miriam followed. "Magnus," Gideon said. He didn't offer a hand. Caldwell looked at him, then at Miriam. His face had the careful, managed expression of a man who had decided in advance not to show what he was feeling, which was its own kind of showing it. "You went after my contract," he said. Not loudly, not with the performance of anger, just the fact of it. "We submitted a bid," Miriam said. "You asked them to examine my records. We asked them to apply consistent standards to all bids." She held his gaze. "What they found in your records, they found on their own." He was quiet for a moment. A dry wind came through and lifted some dust off the road and carried it sideways. "I've supplied this county for 30 years, he said. "I know," Miriam said. "I built relationships. I held things together when the supply lines broke down, when nobody else was willing to take the risk." He said it without sentimentality, more like a man reciting a balance sheet. "That counts for something." "It probably did once," she said. And she said it without cruelty. That was the thing Gideon noticed, listening. There was no victory in her voice, no edge of satisfaction. She just said it the way she said most true things, plainly, because that was the shape of it. "But you raised prices beyond what was fair, and you inflated your capacity numbers, and you sent your man Price to threaten us, and you used Harv Pickett to spread lies about our water source." She paused. "A long history isn't a permission for all of that." Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the yard behind her, the wagons, the women working, the crates of produce and bread, the garden beds still going in October, the whole impossible thing she'd built in a yard that had been decorated gravel 7 months ago. "Your husband's a fool for letting you run this far ahead of him," he said. "Gideon makes his own decisions," she said. Caldwell looked at Gideon. "You let her do this." "She didn't ask my permission," Gideon said. "She asked my opinion." "There's a difference." He met Caldwell's eyes. "We're past talking, Magnus. You should go." Another silence. Caldwell gathered his reins. He didn't say anything else. No threat, no parting word, just the long look of a man who has found the edge of what his power will do and doesn't yet know what that means for him. Then he turned the wagon and drove back up the road the way he'd come. They watched until he was gone. "That's the last of it?" Gideon asked. "Probably not the last," Miriam said. "But the worst of it." She turned back toward the yard. "Francis, careful with those. They're packed tight on the left side." Francis adjusted her grip on the crate and kept moving. Go. The first delivery went out on October 8th. 3 wagons loaded before dawn, Gideon driving the main one, Delbert Foss having shown up at 4 in the morning without being asked, because that was what Delbert did, and a young man from town named Cass who'd been hired for delivery days, and who was strong and mostly reliable and sometimes overslept. He hadn't overslept that morning. Miriam stood at the gate and watched them go. It was still dark, just the gray beginning of it at the eastern edge of the sky, cold enough to see your breath. She had her coat on and her hands in her pockets, and she watched the wagons until they turned off the road toward the rail depot and she couldn't see them anymore. Then she went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with the provisioning letter and the first official delivery manifest, and the records book, which was a new, heavier book now, the old one having been filled in September. She sat there in the quiet before the rest of the operation woke up and let herself feel, for a few minutes, the specific weight of what had happened. Not triumphantly. She wasn't built for triumph exactly, didn't know quite what to do with it when it arrived. What she felt was closer to the feeling you get when you've been carrying something heavy for a long time and you've finally set it down and your arms still remember the weight of it even though it's gone. She thought about Ohio, about the house after her father died, and the long months of working for someone else's family, on someone else's land, building someone else's stability while her own future contracted around her. She had made a practical decision when she answered Gideon's letter. She was honest enough with herself to know that. She had needed somewhere to go, and she had seen a piece of land, and a man who seemed like he wouldn't be cruel, and she had made the calculation that cruelty avoided and land available was the best arrangement she could manage at the time. But then she had gotten here, and the land had been different than the letter, and the man had been different than she'd expected, and the gravel in the front yard had been something nobody had bothered to look under. That was the thing she kept coming back to, even now. Not the contract, not the bid, not Caldwell's disqualified numbers. The gravel. The fact that what she'd been looking for had been buried under something decorative and nobody had thought to ask what was underneath. She had learned something in the past 7 months that she hadn't known she didn't know. Not about farming. She'd always known about farming. About people. About what happens when you show someone what's possible and then work alongside them instead of in front of them. Cecilia hadn't needed to be led. Dot hadn't needed to be managed. Ruth had needed, simply, to be asked. Alma had needed one person to hand her responsibility and then not take it back. You couldn't do this alone. That was the part that surprised her. She'd spent enough years alone that she'd half convinced herself she preferred it, that moving fast was easier without someone else's pace to consider, that building something was cleaner without the friction of another person's doubts and needs and different way of doing things. But Gideon had pushed back on her numbers, and it had made the numbers better. Cecilia had told her something in August about how the bean beetles moved in dry weather that she hadn't known, and it had saved 2 beds. Dot's root cellar was better than hers, and Ruth's barn space was better than anything they could have built from scratch. And Alma's bread was, honestly, more consistent than Miriam's own. The thing she'd built was not something she could have built alone. That was not a comfortable truth for a woman who had spent most of her adult life making herself not need anyone. But it was the truth. And she had enough respect for the truth to sit with it in the early morning dark without looking away. Gideon came back from the delivery at 10:30 with an empty wagon and a receipt signed by the rail company's supply officer and a look on his face that she couldn't quite read from the gate. She walked out to meet him. "How was it?" she said. He got down from the wagon and handed her the receipt. She looked at it. Everything accounted for. Delivery accepted. Quantities confirmed. The supply officer said it was the most organized delivery he'd received in 4 years, Gideon said. He said it carefully, like he was making sure to get it right. She looked at the receipt and didn't say anything for a moment. "He wrote it down?" she said. "He wrote it in the record book right in front of me." Gideon paused. "I made sure he did." She looked up at him. He was watching her with the quiet, particular expression she'd come to know. Not performance, not sentiment, just Gideon being present in the way he was present when something mattered, and he knew it mattered. This man who had stood at the edge of his own property, with his hat in his hands, waiting for a stranger to arrive and had then, against all practical expectation, kept up with everything she threw at him. He was not what she'd expected. He was better than what she'd expected, which was harder to know what to do with. "Thank you," she said, "for making sure." "That's the job," he said. "Gideon, I know," he said quietly. She wasn't sure what she'd been going to say. Maybe nothing specific. She folded the receipt and put it in her pocket, and they walked back to the house together in the October morning, the dry stalks of the finished summer crops rustling along the fence, the fall bed still working, turnips, kale, late squash, and the table at the gate with its canvas cover and its sign, standing in the sun where the decorative gravel used to be. The barn got finished in November. Gideon had started the repairs in September. The family barn, the one his father had built, and that had been sitting half-collapsed at the back of the property since the year after Thomas Mercer died, when there'd been neither money nor will to fix it. He'd started because Miriam had asked him about it in an offhand way one evening, just what would it take to fix that barn, the way she asked most things that she'd already decided deserved an answer. He'd looked at it for a while and come up with a number. The number was now available, so he fixed the barn. It took most of October. He did most of it himself with Del Burr's help on the heavy sections and cast for a few days when the roof needed 2 people. It was not a fast process, and it was not a clean one. He fell off the low scaffolding once, which produced a bruised hip and a week of moving carefully, and Miriam saying nothing about it but watching him walk with a focus he found both irritating and oddly comforting. The barn was not, when it was finished, beautiful. It was sound. It would hold. That was enough. He planted roses along the south fence in November, from cuttings he'd been keeping in pots in the lean-to since September. Clara had planted roses there in the early years of their marriage. He'd let them go after she died. Hadn't been able to look at them properly. And then one season they were gone and he'd told himself it didn't matter. He planted them on a Saturday afternoon while Miriam was going over the November supply schedule inside. He told her he was going to work on the fence line, which was technically accurate. She came out at dusk when the light was going low and cold, and found him pressing the last cutting into the ground, and stood at a few feet's distance looking at the row of them. "Claire's roses?" she said. He looked up. He shouldn't have been surprised she knew. She noticed things, absorbed information the way the soil absorbed water, quietly and completely. "Delbert told you." "Cecilia told me." Delbert told Cecilia. She looked at the row of cuttings, small and unpromising in the November ground. "They'll take a year before they do much." "I know." He stood up, brushing the dirt from his knees. "I've got time." She looked at the cuttings for another moment. He watched her face, which was doing the thing it sometimes did when something moved her and she hadn't decided yet what to do with it. "They'll be good in spring," she said finally, "with the garden beds." "That's what I thought," he said. They walked inside together. "Well, there are people who believe that the only things worth keeping are the things that come easily. That difficulty is a sign you're going the wrong way." Miriam Ashcroft had never believed that, not even as a girl in Ohio watching her father work ground that didn't want to be worked. Some things worth having are buried. Some things worth building resist being built. The resistance is not a message. It's just the nature of things that matter. What she had found in Kansas was not what she'd gone looking for. She'd gone looking for stability, for ground to stand on, for a life with enough room in it to breathe. She'd found all of those things, eventually, but sideways, through soil that had been buried under rock for 25 years, through women who needed someone to ask instead of tell, through a man who was slower than her and more careful and almost always right when he pushed back, and through a fight with a powerful man that she had not wanted but had not walked away from. Because some things you don't get to walk away from without losing something you can't replace. She had not won because she was smarter than Magnus Caldwell, though she may have been. She had won because she was willing to do the work of being right, to document and record and write letters and ask questions and build relationships that were real instead of convenient, and then to let the weight of all of that accumulated effort speak for itself when the moment came. That was the only way she knew. It was slow and it was unglamorous, and there were nights in August when the numbers didn't work, and the flower was late, and her husband was frustrated and she was tired in a way that sat in her bones and didn't fully leave. It wasn't heroic. It was just what you did when the thing mattered. She thought sometimes about what Caldwell had said at the gate. "Your husband's a fool for letting you run this far ahead of him." She thought about it not because it stung. It didn't, really. But because of how wrong it was in a specific way. Gideon had not let her do anything. He had not needed to let her. He had watched what she was building and made his own decision to build it alongside her. And that was a different thing entirely. And it was, she had come to understand, much rarer. Most men would have stopped her at the gravel. Winter settled over the Kansas plains the way it did. Not gently, not brutally, just completely. With the particular authority of something that has been here long before you and will be here long after. The produce stand closed for the season. The garden beds were turned over and mulched. The bread operation scaled down to twice weekly for the provisioning contract, which continued on schedule through December. On the first real cold morning of the year, Miriam stood at the front gate and looked at the front yard, at the garden beds standing dormant in their rows, the dark soil visible through the mulch, the fence with the new rose cuttings along the south side. The road was empty in the early quiet. The sky was the flat gray of a Kansas winter, low and total, the kind of sky that makes everything underneath it look very small and very definite. Gideon came and stood beside her. They didn't say anything for a while. "Next season," she said eventually, "I want to try winter squash in the third bed. The soil drainage there is better than I realized." "You'll need to amend the north end," he said. "It compacts." "I know. I was thinking bone meal and compost, worked in early." "That'd do it." Another silence. "The first quarter performance review is in January," she said. "I know." He paused. "We'll be ready. She looked at the garden beds, at the dormant brown rows of turned earth that had been gravel and nothing 7 months ago, that would be green again in spring, that were full of potential right now, under the cold surface, waiting. Yeah, she said, we will. She wasn't talking only about the review, and he knew it. He put his hand beside hers on the fence post. Not a gesture, just the fact of both of them standing in the same place, looking at the same land. And they stood like that in the morning cold while the road stayed empty and the sky stayed gray, and the ground beneath their feet held everything that winter held and everything that would come up green from it when the time came, because that was what good ground did. It kept what was given to it. It gave back more than you put in. That had always been the promise of it. That had always been enough.